to be crucified.
For centuries, the image of Pontius Pilate washing his hands has been a symbol of shirking responsibility. But for the man himself, the consequences were far more horrifying. In this video, we'll expose the terrible death of Pontius Pilate, as they never told you.
He's not a king, he's not an emperor. This is the best he can do. But what he did gave us the name of Pilate in stone.
Legend whispers of a terrible death, a slow unraveling fueled by a single agonizing decision. Was it divine retribution or a man crumbling under the weight of his conscience? Watch as we delve into the life and horrifying demise of the governor who condemned Jesus. A descent from power into a madness darker than any execution. Let's get into it. Who is Pontius Pilate? While only mentioned once in Scripture, Pontius Pilate stands as a pivotal figure in biblical history. He bore direct responsibility for the crucifixion of Jesus, a decision that has shaped religious narratives for millennia. Pilate's name became synonymous with a choice that defied both logic and justice. Faced with the crowd's fervent demand, he allowed the release of Barabbas, a notorious criminal, over Jesus, who Pilate acknowledged was innocent. Even a premonition from his wife, who dreamt of Jesus and urged Pilate to stay out of the matter, couldn't sway his course of action. In the end, Pilate surrendered Jesus to be crucified. In a symbolic gesture that history remembers, Pilate washed his hands, attempting to absolve himself of any wrongdoing. However, this act of self-preservation could never erase the burden of his fateful decision. Historical backdrop. The first century after Christ saw the Roman Empire flexing its imperial muscles. Its vast territory stretched from the windswept shores of the British Isles to the sun-drenched sands of Egypt, encompassing a vibrant tapestry of cultures and religions. But amidst this grandeur, a simmering tension brewed within the province of Judea, a strategically important crossroads on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Judea, a land steeped in rich history and unwavering faith, harbored a deep-seated resistance to Roman occupation. The Romans, with their polytheistic practices and emphasis on order, imposed a stark contrast to the Jewish population's monotheistic beliefs and rebellious spirit. This cultural divide ran deep, fueled by a constant clash of ideologies. Roman deities, with their multiple faces and demands for sacrifices, stood in stark contrast to the singular God of Israel worshipped by the Jews. Further complicating matters, the Jews viewed their land not as a conquered territory, but as a birthright promised by God to Abraham, their revered ancestor. This fervent belief fueled a constant undercurrent of resistance against Roman control. To maintain a firm grip on this volatile region, Rome needed a strong, authoritative figure. Enter Pontius Pilate, a Roman prefect appointed during the reign of Emperor Tiberius Caesar. Pilate wielded significant power. It was his responsibility to ensure order, sometimes resorting to force to quell any uprisings. He also oversaw the collection of taxes, a system that often sparked resentment. In fact, a future disciple of Jesus, Matthew, once served as a tax collector under Roman rule, experiencing firsthand the friction between the Jewish populace and the Roman administration. This complex web of power dynamics, religious beliefs, and simmering resentment provided the backdrop for the pivotal events that would forever link the names of Pontius Pilate and Jesus of Nazareth. Pilate, the iron-fisted Roman governor, and Jesus, a charismatic preacher challenging the status quo, were about to become central figures in a drama that would reverberate throughout history. Jesus' role. Jesus' presence in Judea wasn't confined to the dusty roads of Galilee. He made frequent visits to Jerusalem, particularly during major festivals like Passover, a time when large, restless crowds thronged the city. From a Roman perspective, these gatherings were tinderboxes waiting for a spark, and Jesus' presence amidst them couldn't have been comforting. But Jesus wasn't there simply to celebrate. There were clashes with the established religious order. He challenged the temple authorities, potentially questioning their interpretations of the law or criticizing their practices. This ruffled feathers and threatened the power structure, creating friction between Jesus and the temple priests. More worrisome for the Romans was the content of Jesus' teachings. His message of a coming kingdom resonated deeply with the common people yearning for freedom from Roman rule. Roman ears likely interpreted this as a coded call for rebellion, a direct challenge to their dominance. The growing popularity Jesus enjoyed among the crowds added another layer of concern. His charisma drew large followings, making him an unpredictable figure. The Roman perspective likely viewed this popularity with suspicion, fearing it could be easily manipulated to ignite unrest. In essence, Jesus' activities in Judea were a source of anxiety for the Romans. His presence in Jerusalem during volatile gatherings, his challenges to the religious hierarchy, and his message of a coming kingdom all fueled Roman suspicion. His growing popularity, while not inherently negative, became a potential catalyst for rebellion in Roman eyes. This underlying tension ultimately laid the groundwork for the events surrounding Jesus' arrest and trial. Roman perspective on Judea. From a Roman standpoint, Judea was a constant headache. It was a restless province, simmering with rebellion. The Jewish customs, particularly their monotheistic beliefs and restrictions on imagery, seemed strange and suspicious to the Romans. Roman rule was all about order and showcasing power, and Judea, with its traditions and frequent uprisings, seemed to constantly defy that. This clash came to a head with the incident involving the standards in Caesarea. Here Pilate, a strong governor who had kept Judea in check for a decade through sometimes ruthless means, tried to impose Roman symbols. The Jewish resistance forced him to back down, highlighting the deep tension between Roman authority and Jewish beliefs. Figures like Jesus, who preached about a coming kingdom, were viewed with a wary eye. His message, interpreted as a challenge to Roman dominance, posed a potential threat. The Jewish authorities, particularly the high priest Caiaphas, saw Jesus as a critic and a danger to their own power. They played a key role in Jesus' arrest, hoping to quell this potential source of unrest. Pilate's decision to condemn Jesus stemmed from a Roman governor's primary concern: maintaining order. Passover was a tense time, and Jesus' claims of being the Messiah were seen as a direct provocation. By condemning him, Pilate aimed to eliminate a potential rallying point for rebellion and ensure Roman control over Judea. The war. In the Roman city of Caesarea, a flashpoint erupted between the iron fist of Roman rule and the unwavering faith of the Jews. The incident centered around the standards, symbolic emblems of Roman power emblazoned with images likely depicting the emperor or Roman gods. Governor Pilate, accustomed to a decade of keeping Judea under control, ordered these standards to be erected within the city. This seemingly innocuous act ignited a firestorm. The Jewish population, with their strong monotheistic beliefs and aversion to idolatry, viewed the standards as an affront to their religion. A tense standoff ensued. The Romans, accustomed to enforcing their will, likely underestimated the depth of Jewish resistance. Faced with unwavering opposition, Pilate, in a rare display of concession, was forced to back down. The removal of the standards became a symbol of the clash between Roman dominance and Jewish religious convictions. This event foreshadowed the simmering tensions that would ultimately contribute to the events surrounding Jesus. The Bible versus atheist thinkers on Pilate. The Bible establishes Pontius Pilate as a key figure in the story of Jesus. However, some argue that both Jesus and Pilate might be purely fictional characters. But what if there's more to the story? If Jesus and Pilate were simply inventions, how do we explain the existence of Roman coins bearing Pilate's face? These coins, unearthed by archaeologists, stand as tangible evidence of his existence. Furthermore, recent discoveries in Caesarea Maritima, an ancient Roman city, include inscriptions mentioning Pilate on the base of a statue. These physical artifacts paint a clearer picture of the man beyond the biblical narrative. Adding to the weight of evidence are writings by philosophers who lived during Jesus' time. Philo, a prominent Jewish scholar, mentions Pilate in his works, describing him as an inflexible, fearful, and harsh ruler. These historical documents detail specific events involving Pilate, such as his controversial plan to build an aqueduct in Judea. To fund this project, Pilate demanded money from the sacred treasury of the Jerusalem temple. This move enraged the temple priests, who viewed the funds as untouchable. Pilate, however, threatened them with increased taxes, forcing them to reluctantly agree. There was one crucial condition: the agreement and the water flow through the temple's reservoirs were to be kept secret. News of the deal eventually leaked, igniting a firestorm of protest among the Jewish population. They felt betrayed by their own priests and angered by Pilate's heavy-handed tactics. The situation escalated, with some protesters arrested and even executed for rebelling against the Roman Empire. While this incident showcases the tense relationship between Roman authority and Jewish religious beliefs, it pales in comparison to the most significant event associated with Pilate, the trial of Jesus of Nazareth. Brought before Pilate by the Jewish authorities on charges of blasphemy and rebellion, Jesus' fate would forever be intertwined with the name of Pontius Pilate. The Gospels and Pilate's involvement with Jesus. Here it's worth taking a brief pause in the story to talk about Pilate's involvement in the fate of Jesus, and consequently in the lives of all of us Christians. This was recorded in the four Gospels of the New Testament in somewhat different ways according to each of the authors: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each author offers a slightly different perspective on Pilate's involvement in Jesus' fate. Matthew paints Pilate as a man struggling with indecision and a lack of authority. In chapter 27, he questions Jesus, even acknowledging his innocence, then offers the crowd a bizarre choice: release Jesus or Barabbas, a known criminal. This chapter also introduces Pilate's wife, who warns him to stay out of the matter, but is ultimately ignored. Mark emphasizes Pilate's desire to spare Jesus. He seems perplexed by Jesus' silence in the face of accusations and wonders why a man from Nazareth wouldn't defend himself. Mark depicts Pilate questioning the crowd, urging them to reconsider their demand for crucifixion, and even asking, "What crime has he committed?" Luke portrays Pilate as a leader hesitant to take responsibility for such a weighty decision. In chapter 23, after finding no guilt in Jesus, he tries to shift the responsibility onto Herod Antipas, a Judean ruler notorious for beheading John the Baptist. However, Herod sends Jesus back to Pilate, who ultimately hands Jesus over to the Jewish people. John paints a contrasting picture, showing Pilate with a more arrogant demeanor. Here, Pilate questions Jesus' claim to be king and mocks the concept of the Messiah. John presents Pilate as a man who, despite internal conflict, ultimately allows Jesus to be crucified. Pilate's true nature. The image of the Jews as solely responsible for Jesus' death has unfortunately fueled the imaginations of Christian writers throughout history. From the early church fathers to medieval and modern authors, this portrayal has seeped into the collective consciousness, creating a dangerous prejudice against Jewish people for centuries. Ordinary folks, seeing their Jewish neighbors, see ghosts of the killers from first-century Jerusalem. At the heart of this controversy lies Pontius Pilate. The concept of Jewish blood guilt rests on Pilate supposedly succumbing to their pressure. However, the historical reality is far more complex. The Romans had their own reasons for condemning Jesus. His trial wasn't an isolated event, but one of many in which a volatile people, as some Romans viewed the Jews, were subdued by a ruthless governor. Traditionally, Pilate has been depicted as a weak figure, easily swayed by the Jewish crowd. But this portrayal may be inaccurate. Sources outside the Gospels paint a different picture: a competent, strong-willed leader. His actions, such as the brutal suppression of the Galilean pilgrims and the attack on Mount Gerizim, suggest a man not easily intimidated. The hidden role of priests. Within the opulent halls of the Jerusalem temple, a web of religious authority and political maneuvering ensnared Jesus. The high priest, Caiaphas, along with his fellow temple priests, viewed Jesus with a growing sense of hostility. Jesus' fiery sermons, delivered with an undeniable charisma, rattled the established order. He challenged the interpretation of religious law, questioning the very foundation of the priest's authority. His critiques of their practices, potentially perceived as corrupt or self-serving, resonated with the crowds, further eroding the priests' influence. Beyond the threat to their prestige, the priests harbored a deeper fear. Jesus' message resonated with the common people, particularly the idea of a coming messianic kingdom. The priests interpreted this as a veiled rebellion against Roman rule, a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Unrest and uprisings were anathema to the priests, who carefully navigated a precarious balance of power with the Roman authorities. Jesus, with his growing following and potentially subversive message, could ignite the very flames they sought to extinguish. Driven by a potent mix of self-preservation and a genuine concern for maintaining order, the temple priests took a decisive step. They actively collaborated with the Roman authorities. Judas Iscariot, a disillusioned disciple, may have been influenced by promises or threats from the priests, ultimately agreeing to betray Jesus' location. With Jesus identified and his movements monitored, the priests facilitated his arrest by the Roman soldiers. Their actions, fueled by a combination of threatened authority, religious conservatism, and a calculated desire to maintain Roman favor, played a critical role in setting the stage for Jesus' trial and ultimate fate. Pilate's choice in washing his hands. The pressure mounted on Pontius Pilate as the Jewish leaders demanded Jesus' condemnation. They painted him as a threat not just to public order, but to Roman authority itself. However, their underlying fear was likely a potential rebellion, fueled by Jesus' teachings. John's Gospel recounts how Pilate questioned Jesus, who declared his kingdom wasn't an earthly one, but a realm of truth. After this conversation, Pilate believed Jesus was innocent of any rebellion against Rome. Despite this belief, Pilate lacked the courage to stand against the Jewish crowd clamoring for Jesus' crucifixion. The situation between Romans and Jews was already tense, and Pilate prioritized appeasing the masses over his own moral compass. Adding another layer to the story is a Passover tradition, the release of a prisoner. Pilate offered Jesus' release, but the crowd roared for Barabbas, a notorious criminal, to be freed instead. Seeing her husband under immense pressure, Pilate's wife Claudia intervened. According to the Bible, while Pilate presided over the trial, Claudia sent him a message: "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." Matthew, however, faced with the insistent crowd and the fear of sparking a major rebellion, Pilate resorted to a symbolic gesture, washing his hands publicly. This act was meant to absolve him of any responsibility, placing the burden on the people and the religious leaders. At last, Jesus was led outside Jerusalem to Golgotha, also known as Calvary, and crucified. This brutal form of execution involved horrific torture. Roman soldiers would nail his hands and feet to a large wooden cross, leaving him to hang in agonizing pain for hours, or even days until he suffocated or died from exhaustion. The weight of the body would pull down on his chest cavity, making breathing difficult. Public humiliation was another aspect of the punishment, as Jesus was left to die exposed on the hill. Pilate's motivations. As governor of Judea, maintaining order was paramount for Pontius Pilate, especially during Passover when large, restless crowds flooded Jerusalem. Jesus' growing popularity and claims of being the Messiah presented a potential powder keg. From a Roman perspective, this could easily incite unrest, a nightmare scenario during a volatile time. Furthermore, Jesus' message of a coming kingdom could be interpreted as a direct challenge to Roman authority, potentially igniting a rebellion. Pilate couldn't ignore the threat this posed to Roman control. Beyond maintaining order, political expediency played a role. The Jewish leaders, particularly Caiaphas, vehemently pushed for Jesus' condemnation. Appeasement offered a smoother path for Pilate, avoiding a messy confrontation and ensuring a more stable governing experience. It's possible Pilate's understanding of Jesus' message was limited. The nuances of a Jewish Messiah and the spiritual nature of Jesus' teachings might have been lost on him. He might have interpreted Jesus' claims literally, seeing him as a political threat rather than a religious one. Pilate was reluctant. His attempt to release Barabbas suggests a desire to avoid condemning Jesus altogether. However, faced with the possibility of a riot and the unwavering pressure from the Jewish authorities, Pilate may have felt he had no choice but to act out decisively. Pilate's motivations were a complex web of maintaining order, eliminating a perceived threat, political expediency, and a degree of forced action. His primary goal remained the same: ensure stability in Judea and protect Roman interests, even if it meant condemning a figure he might not have fully understood. The consequences of Pilate's actions. The biblical narrative ends with Pontius Pilate washing his hands of responsibility for Jesus' fate. However, his story as the Roman prefect of Judea doesn't conclude there. Historical accounts paint a picture of a man wrestling with the consequences of his decision. While the Gospels portray Pilate as hesitant or conflicted during Jesus' trial, some historical records suggest a different side to his character. 3 years after the crucifixion, Pilate's actions reveal a harsher governor. He brutally suppressed a group of Galilean pilgrims who were offering sacrifices in the temple, resorting to violence and bloodshed. This act of brutality was followed by another controversial move. Fearing a potential rebellion, Pilate ordered his troops to attack a gathering of Samaritans on Mount Gerizim. The heavy-handed tactics further inflamed tensions with the Jewish population. These events sparked outrage. A delegation of Jewish leaders traveled to Emperor Tiberius, lodging a formal complaint against Pilate's oppressive rule. Their pleas for intervention bore fruit, and in 37 AD, Pilate was removed from his position. Some scholars see a subtle evolution in Pilate's leadership. They argue that the earlier incident with the Roman standards, which caused outrage among the Jews, taught him a harsh lesson. Perhaps they suggest the massacre of the Galileans and the attack on Mount Gerizim reflect a shift towards harsher tactics, a no-nonsense approach to maintaining Roman control. This interpretation directly contrasts the image of a hesitant Pilate presented in the Gospels. The historical record remains fragmented, offering glimpses into Pilate's actions, but leaving many details shrouded in mystery. The Gospels themselves may hold hidden clues. While they don't explicitly mention the aqueduct riot, some scholars believe cryptic references hint at unrest during Pilate's tenure. The story of Pontius Pilate is a study in contrast. The Gospels portray a man caught in a difficult situation, while historical accounts suggest a more ruthless leader. Regardless of the nuances, one thing remains clear. Pilate's decision regarding Jesus' fate left a lasting shadow on his life and legacy. Pilate's removal from power and death. The irony of history is rarely lost. Those who celebrated Pilate's decision to condemn Jesus wouldn't enjoy their victory for long. In the same year, the high priest Caiaphas, who had spearheaded the accusations against Christ, was also stripped of his position by Vitellius, the governor of Syria. The power they wielded seemed to melt away like desert sand. The winds of change swept across Rome with the death of Emperor Tiberius. Caligula, a notoriously cruel leader, ascended the throne. Under his rule, Pilate's fortunes took a turn for the worse. He was stripped of his position and exiled to the remote region of Gaul, an area encompassing modern-day France. This was a far cry from the power and prestige Pilate once cherished. Banished from Judea, his life unraveled. Consumed by bitterness and regret, some accounts suggest Pilate ended his own life. Thus, the story of Pontius Pilate concludes, a man stripped of his authority, condemned to a lonely exile far from the land he once ruled. His fate serves as a stark reminder that the consequences of our actions can reach far beyond the immediate moment, leaving an indelible mark on our lives and legacies. Conclusion. Exiled, disgraced, and possibly consumed by guilt, Pilate's story offers a chilling message. Washing your hands of a difficult choice doesn't erase the consequences. It can leave an indelible stain, haunting you long after the act itself. It is worth recalling what the Bible says. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Pilate stood before Jesus Christ, and this encounter could have transformed his life forever if he had simply looked at the Master in the right way, as the Son of God who had come into the world to bear witness to his truth. Unfortunately, power, greed, and concern about what others were thinking created darkness within his heart. This caused this Roman leader to be unable to feel the wonderful presence of the Holy Spirit. Jesus' future would not have been different even if Pilate had listened to his wife and decided to set him free, because God had already determined that his son needed to sacrifice himself to free the world from the condemnation of sin. However, surely Pilate could have been saved by recognizing and declaring that this man truly was who he claimed to be. Similarly, Jesus is before you now for you to recognize. How do your eyes see him? As just a Jewish prophet who was killed for defending his faith, or as the very living God who became man and came to earth to save us? Your decision will not change who Jesus is and what he will do, but it will certainly change your entire story from here to eternity. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.